Did NATO just cross the line Europe spent years trying not to touch? And if that line has finally been crossed, what happens the next time Russian drones come back over a NATO border? Before we go deeper, hit like if you want analysis without panic, subscribe if you want the full story instead of headlines, and share this with the one friend who always asks what the next move means. For years, this was the routine: sirens, radar tracks, a target near the border, a burst of fear, then a statement from officials that sounded almost identical to the last one. An object entered Allied airspace. It was monitored. Authorities assessed the situation. There was no immediate threat to the public. Investigations were underway. It was serious, but somehow still treated like something that had not quite crossed into a new reality. Now that routine is breaking. Because this time, Romania did not just track Russian drones and wait for them to leave. Romanian F-16s went up. NATO aircraft were already active. Targets were followed. Missiles were launched. And over one extraordinary stretch of 72 hours, Russian-made drones that entered Romanian airspace were destroyed one after another. Not once, not as a fluke, not as some accidental one-night exception, 3 times. That is why this moment matters far beyond Romania. This is not just a story about 3 drones being shot out of the sky. It is a story about a rule that had quietly shaped NATO's eastern edge for years. A rule built on caution, a rule built on fear of escalation, a rule built on one uncomfortable question: is any single drone worth the risk of a larger confrontation between Russia and the alliance? For a long time, the practical answer was almost always no, even when debris fell near villages, even when explosions happened dangerously close to the border, even when radar showed objects crossing into NATO territory, long enough to make military planners and civilians hold their breath. Jets were scrambled, alerts were issued, watches were kept, but the instinct underneath it all was restraint. Get aircraft airborne, protect the population, avoid firing unless there is absolutely no other choice. Romania has now shown that the threshold is changing. It did not treat these incursions as bad weather. It did not treat them as paperwork. It treated them as hostile objects entering Allied airspace. And once a state starts treating the problem that way, the whole meaning of the event changes. A violation is no longer just something to record. It becomes something to stop. That is the real significance hiding inside the headline. People hear a title like this and imagine NATO suddenly attacking Russia in some sweeping, dramatic, new phase of war. That is not what happened. This was not an offensive strike campaign. This was not an attack on Russian territory. This was not the alliance choosing open war. It was a defensive engagement inside or directly adjacent to Romanian sovereign space, carried out by a NATO member protecting its own sky under a wider alliance security framework. That difference is not a detail. It is the core of the entire story. Because it tells us something very clear. The old gray zone is shrinking. For Moscow, the gray zone has been useful. Drone appears near a border. It crosses briefly. It turns away. It crashes. It leaves wreckage. It creates fear, attention, uncertainty, and political argument. But because the event stays cloudy, there's always room for denial. Maybe it was off course. Maybe electronic warfare disrupted guidance. Maybe it was spillover from a strike on Ukraine. Maybe it was not intentional. Every maybe created hesitation on the NATO side. Every maybe bought time. For years, that hesitation worked. But when the same kind of dangerous incident keeps happening, the debate slowly changes. States stop asking only what the other side intended and start focusing on what physically happened. If a strike drone is over your land, your people do not care whether the path was deliberate, reckless, or accidental. What matters is that it is there. What matters is that it can kill. What matters is that your airspace has been violated and your civilians are under an object built for war. That is the deeper shift here. Romania appears to be saying that the old argument over intent is no longer enough to delay action. Whether the drone entered on purpose or by reckless spillover, the operational result is the same. It is in NATO airspace. That fact now seems to weigh more heavily than the old diplomatic ambiguity. And to understand why this happened now, you have to zoom in on one of the most tense pieces of geography in Europe, the zone where Romania, Ukraine, the Danube Delta, and the Western Black Sea all meet. This is not some quiet edge of the map. It is a pressure chamber. On the Ukrainian side are key port areas and export routes that matter for trade, especially grain traffic. On the Romanian side are villages, infrastructure, roads, and the sovereign territory of a NATO country. In some areas, the distance is so small that war does not feel far away. It feels next door. When Russia hits targets on the Ukrainian bank, people on the Romanian side can hear the blasts, feel the tension, and see the glow. This is not a distant strategic theater to them. It is part of their nights that matters, because repeated strikes in that corridor create repeated opportunities for drones, fragments, or misdirected paths to enter Romanian space. One incident can be dismissed. 2 can be explained. A long pattern is different. A long pattern becomes a security problem that no responsible state can keep pretending is temporary. And permanent security problems force choices. You either normalize them or you draw a line. Romania has now drawn one. What makes the whole episode even more powerful is the rhythm. One shootdown can be framed as a special case. 2 raises hard questions. 3 in 72 hours starts to feel like the early shape of doctrine. It feels less like improvisation and more like policy. Somewhere inside the chain of command, the calculation appears to have changed. The cost of not firing had become greater than the cost of firing. That is the true event. And it did not come from nowhere. Pressure had been building. Military concern had been growing. Every prior incursion added another layer. Every recovered piece of wreckage, every warning siren, every nervous question from citizens near the border pushed the same issue closer to the center. How many times can a NATO state tell its people that dangerous Russian drones entered its airspace and still do nothing physical to stop them? At some point, caution begins to look less like wisdom and more like permission. That is exactly the trap Romania seems determined to escape. And here is the broader strategic meaning. Moscow has long used ambiguity as a tool of pressure, not just tanks and missiles. Ambiguity, a drone with unclear purpose, a violation with uncertain intent, GPS disruption, cyber pressure, suspicious infrastructure incidents, border tests that stay just below the threshold of direct collective military response, but still create stress, division, and fatigue. This is the logic of hybrid pressure. Keep the other side tense, keep it reactive, keep it arguing with itself. But hybrid pressure works best when the target keeps absorbing it without changing the rules. Romania may have just changed the rules, and if that is true, then the message is much bigger than 3 destroyed drones. The message is that at least one part of NATO's eastern flank is moving from passive observation to active denial, not merely tracking incursions, but ending them. That matters from the Baltic region all the way down to the Black Sea, because the alliance has been learning hard lessons. It has learned that cheap drones can force very expensive responses. It has learned that small border incidents can reveal radar behavior, readiness levels, launch timelines, and political hesitation. It has learned that every incursion is also a test. How fast do the jets scramble? Which systems switch on? What do governments say publicly? Where is the real threshold? Those answers are valuable intelligence. So when a drone enters Allied space and gets destroyed instead of merely observed, the defender is not just protecting territory. It is also changing the data the attacker receives. The answer is no longer, we watched it. The answer becomes, we shut it down. That is a very different lesson. And it is a much more expensive lesson for the side doing the probing. If you're following the pattern so far, subscribe, like you're locking in a radar track, tap like so more people see the deeper picture, and share this with someone who thinks every border incident is just random chaos. Still, this harder line comes with real risks, and we should not pretend otherwise. The first risk is cost. Shooting down low-cost drones with high-end air-to-air missiles is not a clean long-term equation. A drone may cost a fraction of the weapon used to destroy it. If this kind of response becomes frequent, then Romania and other frontline NATO states will need a layered answer behind the fighter jets. Cheaper interceptors, denser sensors, stronger electronic warfare, dedicated anti-drone systems, and a more sustainable shield for repeated violations. The second risk is miscalculation. Any live engagement creates uncertainty. Debris can fall, a missile can miss, a radar picture can become confusing fast. And when military assets belonging to nuclear powers operate near each other under high tension, even small mistakes can become political explosives. That is one reason so many governments hesitated for so long. But hesitation has its own price, too. That is what this entire episode is really about. If you never act, the other side learns that your red lines are soft. If you always delay, delay becomes part of your strategic profile. And once your profile is mapped, pressure increases. What began as testing turns into habit. What began as probing turns into routine. Romania appears to have decided that the danger of endless passivity had become greater than the danger of measured force. That decision does not mean NATO wants escalation. In fact, it may mean the opposite. Controlled defensive action can be a tool of de-escalation if it restores credibility. The logic is simple. If violations are cheap and consequence-free, they continue. If violations lead to fast, predictable loss, they may decline. Deterrence does not have to be loud because it seeks war. Sometimes it is loud because it wants the testing to stop. This is where the word historic becomes more than dramatic packaging. Historic is not only about the missiles, historic is about grammar. For years, the sentence on NATO's eastern edge sounded like this. An object entered Allied airspace, Allied aircraft monitored it, officials assessed the event. Romania's actions changed the verb in that sentence. The object entered Allied airspace and it was shot down. When the verb changes, the whole logic changes with it. And once one NATO country changes its behavior in public, every other frontline state has to ask what that means for its own rules. Poland will think about it. The Baltic states will think about it. Planners looking at Kaliningrad will think about it. Black Sea capitals will think about it. Countries far from the immediate border will think about it too, because credibility at the frontier shapes confidence across the whole alliance. That is why this moment reaches beyond Romania. Romania is not a side character in Europe's security story anymore. It is becoming one of the key frontline states on NATO's southeastern edge. Its geography matters. Its air bases matter. Its role in Black Sea security matters. Its growing fleet and modernization path matter. Its position next to the Ukrainian war zone matters. And if it is now willing to use live fire more consistently to defend its airspace, its weight inside alliance planning rises even more. This is also happening while the Black Sea remains one of the most sensitive theaters in the war. Shipping, trade, energy, military posture, regional influence, and access routes all run through this wider environment. When a country like Romania changes posture there, nearby states update their own calculations immediately. There's another layer many people miss. The target being unmanned matters a lot. Destroying a drone is not the same as shooting down a manned Russian aircraft. That difference is enormous in escalation terms. No pilot is killed. No captured crew becomes a diplomatic emergency. No family becomes the face of a national revenge campaign. The latter is still dangerous, but it is not the highest rung. In other words, drones sit in a zone where defensive force is more usable. That is part of why this could happen now. So this may be the emerging formula. A manned aircraft that violates briefly may still be shadowed, warned, escorted, and pressured out. But an unmanned strike platform entering Allied space presents a much stronger case for destruction. It is still a hard line, but it is a narrower and more politically manageable one than direct action against crewed aircraft. That formula, if it solidifies, matters enormously, because formulas reduce room for games. If the response becomes predictable enough, ambiguity loses some of its value. If the defender keeps saying maybe, the attacker keeps testing. If the defender starts saying this is what happens every time, the attacker faces a new decision. Keep probing and absorb the loss, or shift the method somewhere else. And that leads to the next big question. If pressure gets more expensive over the Danube and the Romanian border, does it simply move? That is entirely possible. Hybrid. Campaigns are fluid. If one door gets stronger, pressure looks for a window. The Baltic region could face more tests. Undersea cables and pipelines could face more attention. GPS interference, cyber disruption, sabotage cells, disinformation pushes, and deniable incidents around infrastructure could all become more attractive if direct airspace incursions become costlier. So no, Romania's response does not solve the wider problem. But it does alter the math in one extremely important sector. And in strategy, changing the math is often the real win. Now think about the symbolism. One of Russia's long-running goals has been to isolate Ukraine and frighten its neighbors into caution, fatigue, and division. The message has been clear again and again. The closer you are to this war, the more pressure you will feel. But what does it mean if one of Ukraine's NATO neighbors now openly destroys Russian-made drones that cross into its skies? It means intimidation can produce the opposite effect. It means pressure can harden the frontier instead of softening it. That does not mean every NATO capital sees everything the same way. Of course not. Threat perception differs. Political language differs. Some governments are more cautious by instinct. Some are more forward-leaning. Some fear escalation most. Others fear hesitation most. Those differences are real, and Moscow has always hoped to exploit them. But reality in the field has its own power. Once something has happened, the argument changes. Before the event, the debate is theoretical. After the event, the debate becomes practical. Not should this ever be done, but what do we do now that it has been done? Endorse it, repeat it, standardize it, limit it? The center of gravity moves, and that may be one of the biggest consequences of all. Romania did not just destroy drones. It may have narrowed the debate inside NATO itself. If this becomes standard practice, then the eastern edge enters a new phase. Not a phase of open war, but a phase of sharper border defense, more kinetic, more predictable, still limited but less hesitant. That is why the 72-hour sequence feels like a bridge between eras. The era of swallowing these incursions and the era of actively rejecting them. Stop here for a second and ask what Moscow learns from that. It learns that routine pressure can stop being routine. It learns that even if every single drone was not meant to enter Romanian airspace, repeated spillover is no longer something the defender is willing to absorb without action. It learns that recklessness itself can now trigger consequence. And it learns that silence after the fact may not be enough to preserve the old gray zone. If this breakdown is helping you connect the dots, leave a like you are marking the map. Subscribe before the next Frontline shift changes. the picture again, and share this video with the person who always says there is more going on here than the headline. Now let's talk about the phrase in the title that will hit hardest for most viewers. NATO opened fire on Russian targets. That phrase is emotionally explosive, but it needs precision. The targets were Russian-made drones, not Russian cities, not Russian bases, not a broad offensive package. The fire was defensive, not expansionary. The engagement happened because those drones crossed into the protected space of a NATO member. That is radically different from the picture many people instantly imagine when they hear that line. Precision matters because this is exactly how big crises get misunderstood. One side says this proves NATO wants war. Another says it is nothing at all. Both are too simple. This is neither the beginning of open alliance war with Russia nor a meaningless border footnote. It sits in the dangerous middle zone where limited force sends a major strategic signal, and the signal is this. NATO territory is not supposed to become a casual spillover lane. If that sounds obvious, it is because it should always have been obvious. The surprise is not the principle. The surprise is how long that principle was softened by caution. That caution was understandable. Nobody wanted to fire the shot that might trigger something bigger. Nobody wanted the tragedy of a failed intercept or falling debris in the wrong place. Nobody wanted to be remembered as the government that turned a tense incident into a wider European crisis. But security policy cannot survive forever on fear of tomorrow's headline. At some point, a state has to prove that sovereignty is not just something it describes. At press conferences, Romania has now done exactly that, and timing matters here too. Repeated incidents create psychological normalization. People hear about one violation and feel alarmed, hear about another and feel concern, hear about 10 and begin filing them away as part of the new normal. That is dangerous, because once the public starts normalizing border incursions, policymakers can start normalizing them too. The unacceptable becomes familiar. The familiar becomes tolerated. Breaking that cycle takes a visible act. A visible act is exactly what happened here. Now every future incursion will be measured against this precedent. If another drone enters and Romania destroys it again, the new rule hardens. If another drone enters and no shot is fired, people will ask why. Was this one different? Was the radar picture unclear? Was the object unarmed? Was the political appetite weaker that day? Precedent deters the adversary, but it also creates obligations for the defender. That is why drawing a red line is dramatic, not only because of what it threatens the other side with, but because of what it commits you to doing next. The world will now watch whether Romania repeats this response with the same speed and confidence. Moscow will watch. The alliance will watch. Civilian populations near the border will watch. Consistency is what turns an incident into doctrine. Without consistency, even a powerful action can fade into symbolism. With consistency, symbolism turns into policy, and policy changes behavior. There's also a civilian side to this that should never be reduced to map arrows. People living near the border are not pieces on a board. They are families hearing sirens late at night. They are children being told to stay calm while adults are checking phones for emergency alerts. They are villagers trying to decide whether the blast they just heard was on the other side of the river or too close for comfort. For them, the debate about escalation sounds very different. If danger keeps crossing overhead, they do not experience it as a strategic seminar. They experience it as fear. So when the state finally acts, it is not just sending a message outward. It is sending one inward too. We will not keep pretending. This is normal. We will not keep asking you to absorb the fear without visible defense. That domestic message matters politically, morally, and emotionally. It also helps explain why live fire becomes easier to justify over time. Public tolerance for passivity has limits. Every government in this situation faces a brutal question. What is the greater failure, taking the shot and accepting the risk, or refusing the shot until something finally lands where it should not? That question hangs over this entire moment. And it may hang over the next one too. So where does this go from here? There are three broad paths. The first path is deterrence, working as intended. Moscow sees the new cost, changes behavior, keeps routes farther from Romanian space, and the incidents become less frequent. If that happens, these three shootdowns may be remembered as the point where a dangerous pattern was finally interrupted. The second path is adaptation. The pressure does not stop. It shifts. New routes, different timing, faster platforms, denser swarms, more electronic warfare, more gray zone activity in other places. If that happens, then Romania's actions still matter, but as one chapter in a contest that evolves very quickly. The third path is escalation through accumulation. Not one huge cinematic event, but a chain of smaller events. Another incursion, another intercept, more debris, sharper rhetoric, higher readiness, more pressure inside NATO to make this standard, more pressure inside Russia to answer politically. That is often how crises deepen in real life, not through one leap, but through repeated steps that leave less and less room for stepping back. Which path is most likely depends on one simple thing: whether this new Romanian posture is seen by Moscow as a real wall or temporary gesture. And that, once again, comes back to repetition. One weekend can shock. Repetition can teach. That is why the next incident may matter almost as much as the first three. Because once a state says this is our line, the line only lives if it is defended again. Maybe that is the deepest lesson in all of this. History is not made only by giant offensives and famous speeches. Sometimes history shifts because one government stops swallowing the same provocation and answers it differently. A missile leaves the rail, a drone falls burning, a habit of restraint breaks, and suddenly the strategic language of an entire region starts changing in front of everyone. That may be what we are seeing now. Not World War III beginning, not a meaningless border footnote, but a serious shift in how NATO's frontier may now defend itself. 3 drones, 72 hours, one unmistakable message. If Russian targets keep entering Allied skies, at least one NATO border is no longer content to simply watch them pass. And if that becomes the standard, then the real importance of this moment is not just that Romania opened fire. It is that the era of nearly free testing may be ending. That is when strategy changes. That is when deterrence becomes visible. That is when every player on the board starts recalculating risk, cost, and political will. So the question now is no longer whether the line exists. The question is who tests it. Next, whether the answer comes just as fast and how much the balance changes once the sky itself starts enforcing the warning.